this is kind of a follow-up to our spring webinar that we did on gardening for biodiversity in general, and this is going to be fall gardening for biodiversity. Now, before we get started, I will make my screen full. There we go. And I would like to just do a little land acknowledgement before we begin, because without all of the stewardship of our First Nations for thousands of years prior to us arriving here, we would not have the opportunities that we do have today. And so in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Arahe Nakota and Tsuut'ina First Nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Otipemisiwak, Métis government of the Métis Nation within Alberta Districts 5 and 6. Finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on this land and who honor and celebrate this territory. And so for those who are not familiar, again, I am with the Weaselhead Glenmore Park Preservation Society, and the Weaselhead, for those that are not familiar with it, is located in Southwest Calgary. So it is just kind of tucked away on the west end, right next to the Tsuut'ina First Nation. And many people often ask why Weaselhead. And so the actual reason for the name is actually lost to history, unfortunately. But we do know that Weaselhead is a traditional name on the Tsuut'ina First Nation. So there's all kinds of stories about how this came to be, but we honor it today as a natural environment park where we try to preserve as much of the natural habitat as we can in honor of Weaselhead. And we do have a lot of stuff that we do as the Preservation Society. We just celebrated our 30-year anniversary this past summer. And so we have a lot of stuff going on. We offer guided hikes. We offer school field trips, we have an invasive plant program, and we have a whole lot of biodiversity throughout the park. We can see things like birds, like moose and bears and frogs and bobcats and butterflies and spiders and all of the things, and a whole lot of plants as well. So let's get to the meat of this webinar. Why should you care about your garden in the fall? It's the end of summer. We've had a wonderful season looking at all those beautiful flowers. Things are starting to get ugly. The desire to clean stuff up is there. But even though that is a drive for us to make our garden clean before winter, before the snow hits, there's still a lot of life going on in your garden. And many insects' lives will actually depend on what you leave in the fall. Fall is also a really busy time for mammals and birds that are preparing for the winter, and they might use your garden as an opportunity to store some of their winter storage. And you can already plan for next year's garden. So what are the things that we most often hear about when we talk about fall cleanup and what you should or should not do are leaves. And there's a big push to leave the leaves. But why? Why should we leave the leaves? Sometimes it looks ugly and sometimes we want to get those out of there because we don't want things to rot over the winter time. But it's providing very important overwintering habitat for a whole lot of insects, including bees, ladybugs, beetles, caterpillars, or even adult butterflies. So things like morning cloak butterflies and great spangled fritillaries actually overwinter as adults. The morning cloaks are one of the first ones that you see in the springtime, along with Milbert's tortoiseshells, and both of them overwinter as adults, so that as soon as the ground thaws and they're able to move and get that sunshine into them to move, they are ready to go. So they can start breeding almost immediately. And they'll have several generations over the summer, and they will have their adults, again, overwintering, sometimes the second or third generation overwintering as an adult. Some of those leaves may already actually also have butterfly or moth eggs on. So when you throw away those leaves, you're potentially throwing away the life that could be coming next year. And one of the fascinating things is that there's so many different strategies that insects have for living in our world. So some of them will overwinter as adults, some as eggs, some as pupa. And this goes across all of these different groups. So sometimes with bees, beetles, again, those butterflies and moths, which are so super important for the biodiversity in our yard, can be in all different life stages under those leaves. These leaves are also an important part of nutrient cycling in the garden so that you don't have to fertilize next year. Even though a lot of the decomposition is not going to be happening over the winter, some of it will, some of the beginning stages are going to happen in the fall and into the winter. And then in the spring, if you have that layer over top, the decomposers that are in the ground are ready to work on it. And you'll have that slow nutrient seepage into your soil rather than the fertilizer that you might blast on it in the spring instead. It's also going to help retain moisture in the soil and prevent evaporation and protect the soil roots holding in some of that moisture. Now, what about those plants? We can see the one on the bottom right there. That looks kind of ugly. That's my milkweed. And every year it does look kind of ugly. But there's a whole lot of things that love to spend their time in those dead leaves. I've been kind of cutting down a few of our stalks because we have a lot, but I'm leaving a good majority of them. And the ones that I do cut down, I'm actually just going to lay them flat on the ground so that insects can hide inside of them. Inside of the leaves is a fantastic place for things like ladybugs to overwinter. So you can cut down your plants if you want, or you can leave them standing. But if you do cut them down, please leave at least 6 inches of stem, because again, those bees, some might be in the egg stage, some might be pupa, and some might be adults that are going to overwinter inside of those stems. It also is a fantastic place for birds to cache some sunflower seeds or any of the seeds that they might find in your garden, or sometimes they found an insect that they stuff into those stems to eat during the winter time. And again, if you want to consider leaving that cut plant on the ground, that's going to hold in that moisture, acting a little bit as a mulch layer. So it's going to prevent evaporation, hold the snow and the moisture that happens when that melts, and also provide that protection for the plant roots that are underneath. And here we can see in the top left, this was a couple of weeks ago. Those ladybugs are already grouping together overnight because those temperatures are getting cool, and they are, oh boy, pardon me. I don't know if you could see that, hopefully not. It was just the startup for my new computer here. If you have those ladybugs, they can actually be gathering together now inside of seed pods. So this is my mountain hollyhock, and I found just a whole lot of them in there. And I'm trying to harvest some of those seeds, but before I do, I have to be careful because ladybugs and spiders and other little critters, some of the flies, will be inside of those seed pods. Other things that you can think about for the fall is starting to think about next year. Maybe you want to add some more plants, or maybe you want to add some more natural features like dead logs. Dead logs are, again, a fantastic place to put up for insects. They can burrow into those crevices, and it also creates a great space for fungi to latch on. So you will have some decomposing fungi that might go inside of that dead wood, and they can contribute into the soil some of their mycelium if they reach far enough, and they might interact into that mycelial network underneath the ground. And if you do want to add plants, anytime before the ground is frozen is a great time to plant native plants. Some of those introduced cultivars are not going to do so well once the frost hits, but our native plants are accustomed to these growing conditions. They're used to having their seeds fall off after the first snow or the first frost. And so they're capable of still being planted after a frost, but before that ground is frozen. So as we know in Calgary, we have those variable freeze-thaw cycles. You could even put them in the ground in November if you happen to come upon something you wanted to put in there. Some of those seeds will actually benefit from going in the fall because some of them need something that's called stratification. And that's essentially where in the fall, they're going to absorb some of that moisture that comes down before freezing. And then once that freezes, it's going to be able to expand inside of that seed and crack a hard shell off of there. And that hard shell is what's preventing it from germinating. And so it needs that freeze-thaw cycle to burst off a hard shell in order to germinate in the spring. Now, one of the reasons it might have that hard shell to begin with is so that it can be viable for several years, so that it doesn't necessarily have to bloom or grow the next season. It can come when conditions are favorable. So it wants to make sure it gets that moisture in there and that freeze thaw. You can mimic this in the fridge. If you forgot to plant things in the fall, you could do it in the spring as well. But it is best if you can get these native plants in the ground because that's the thing they're used to. One of the issues we could potentially have in our Calgary climate is that we do have Chinooks, which can cause that freeze-thaw cycle quite a bit throughout the winter. But our plants, again, they're used to this, and they're going to know when it's safe or hopefully safe, to be able to send down those roots and start growing. You're also going to want to keep watering the garden, not just for those seeds that need stratification, but for your entire garden, because that moisture, even though your plant is going dormant in the fall, it still needs that moisture underneath the ground. The root system is still active. We're still taking up a little bit of water, and we're still involved in nutrient cycling underneath the ground. So what are those plants that need to be stratified? Well, some of them are going to be things like lupins, milkweed, arnica, perennial sunflowers, tall larkspur, coneflowers, and anise hyssop. Now, these are not necessarily mandatory to stratify. Some of these things like lupins may grow without it, and your perennial sunflowers may grow without it, but you're going to have a better turnout of seeds that are germinating if you do stratify them. And there's a little bee fly on that sunflower just as a bonus for you. Another thing to think about is late blooming plants. So even now, it's starting to look that kind of starting to get to be that growth time of year when things are starting to go dormant, leaves are turning brown, and we're seeing kind of an ugly stage. But there's still insects out, and they're going to still need those plants. They need that sugar from those plants. And there are a lot of later blooming plants. Fireweed, mine is unfortunately seems to be done for the season, but there is other ones that might bloom throughout the fall. If you're lucky, you can get fireweed to go longer. Because I didn't water it very much this year due to the water restrictions, I kind of had a shorter growing season. There's also asters. Goldenrod is going to be flowering this time of year. This is really a lot of asters time to shine. Goldenrod's in the aster family, but you can get a lot of those white asters. So you'll see the western willow aster, and you'll see a lot of the different asters, purple stemmed asters blooming right now. Joe Pyeweed is another one, and it's a really good one for also attracting hummingbirds. So just throwing that out there for you. If you want some late season hummingbirds, they are currently migrating through. And if you have flowers blooming for them, especially for the juveniles this time of year that have not learned that feeders mean food, having plants that are blooming is going to ensure that they can make that migration. And then of course, sunflowers. I've got a whole bunch that are flowering right now, and it's beautiful. And these can be the perennial sunflowers or the annual sunflowers. And then there's harebells and also blue flax. They tend to reseed themselves throughout the season, so you'll get flowers happening throughout the entire year. So what's going on underneath the ground in the winter that makes it so important that we care about ensuring that we have the water in there, the moisture, and also the nutrients in there? So in the winter, things are going to be slowing down. And we want to make sure that when we're thinking about things slowing down, we're not thinking about just above ground. Underneath ground, everything is going to slow down, but it doesn't stop. So leaves or mulch are going to help insulate the ground around the plant and protect those root systems, and also make it so that the ground won't necessarily freeze as deep down, allowing organisms that are underneath in the ground to work throughout the winter. So you will find below that frozen soil layer, fungi, bacteria, and some insects like isopods and some worm species that can continue working through the cold months. At the coldest time, they're probably not going to be doing much, but when we have those warmer times, and especially if you have that insulated upper layer, that decomposition can happen, and you're getting nutrients going back into your root system as they're dormant up top. And kind of shifting a little bit over a bit, while we're getting into the fall, we start to think about fall decorations and fall holidays like Halloween or Christmas. Some of those decorations are not great for biodiversity. So things like those cobwebs that you might see around during Halloween are absolutely terrible for birds and insects. You'll find a lot of insects getting stuck in there, and you can get birds like owls that fly into it at night because they're not looking for a sticky trap at night. So they're kind of terrible, and I would advocate not putting them up at all. But other things to think about outside of Halloween are lights. So as Christmas comes along, all of those beautiful lights, and it's wonderful, and I love Christmas lights. But if we could turn them off around 11 o'clock at the latest, that's going to allow all of our nocturnal species that need that dark period for their life cycles to still be going. So birds like owls that are nocturnal, they are around all year, and they need that dark in order to properly function. So just like us, they have circadian rhythms. Theirs is kind of the reverse of ours though, where ours has the light cycle that we want to be awake for. Theirs has the dark cycle that they want to be active during. And so having too many lights on, even in the winter time, can make it so that they can't fulfill their nighttime duties and also have hormonal changes associated with it. And they can have kind of the knock-on effects of all of the hormonal changes as well. And if you are going to have lights ever, this is not just in the fall, this is kind of ever, if we can kind of work on narrowing down that light pollution. So light pollution, for anybody who is unfamiliar with it, is essentially light that is pointing anywhere that it was not intended. And so when you go out and you're coming into Calgary and you see all of those lights, light pollution. And that's hazardous for a lot of different critters, again, because of those nocturnal circadian rhythms that a lot of species have, but also right now in particular for migrating birds. We have millions of birds moving through, trying to get to their winter locations, and a lot of them are naive flyers. This is their first season. They were born this spring. They don't know much about the world, and they don't know how to navigate properly just yet. And lights can really throw them off. We know that they navigate by the stars, by the moon, and they have all sorts of other cues, but that light, just like a glare at night can throw you off course, it can for birds as well. So making sure if you do have lights on at any time during the dark, making them point down. You can see this little graphic here, very bad, all over the place, up, then kind of out to the side, still not great. Better is pointing down, even better is just the area you want lit up. And again, I don't want to ruin all of the fun at Christmas time because I love all of these Christmas lights, but turning them off at 10 or 11 at night so that those nocturnal species can continue. So what is the impact of your fall gardening decisions? Well, it's going to impact a lot of different things. I mentioned insects, but it goes much beyond that. Less habitat in the fall for insects does mean less insects and food for other wildlife in the spring, but also during the fall. Let's take a closer look at some of these species. So ladybugs. Alberta is home to 18 different ladybug species. The ones you're probably most familiar with are going to be the two-spotted and the seven-spotted. Seven-spotted is actually introduced. Two-spotted, I don't know if anybody else noticed, but I feel like it was a really big banner year for two-spotted in my yard. There was a lot of aphids and therefore, thank goodness, a lot of ladybugs. Now, ladybugs overwinter as adults and they lay their eggs in the spring and summer. So this is one of those other ones that their life cycle is variable. And they do have those adults overwintering so that they can get going as soon as the sun is warming them up, in usually around May, and they can lay those eggs and get their babies started on eating all of those aphids for us. And they love to overwinter in our gardens. They will go under leaves. They will go in dead wood. So if you have those dead logs back there, they're going to go in there. Also cracks in homes or in those seed pods. Those hollyhock seed pods are going to be full of them soon. Or sometimes we find them in our house in the wintertime. I found a few in there and they just carry on. If you do have a warmer time, you can put them back outside, but I leave them inside for the winter. And then there's bees. We have so many bees, and unfortunately, we don't tend to know a lot about all of them. Most people think of the most visible ones, which are the bumblebees and the honeybees. Honeybees, of course, are an introduced species, and we know how their life cycle goes because we are most familiar with that in the media. However, Alberta is home to at least 321 native bee species. Most of them are solitary, so they're not the bumblebees that we see, which are social, generally speaking. They're going to be those little itty carpenter bees. They're going to be our sweat bees. They're going to be our mason bees. They're going to be our leafcutter bees. So many different kinds. Bumblebees are forming those colonies in the summer, while those solitary bees might share nesting space in like a bee house that you might find at a garden center, or they might be using those stems or underneath the ground. They might go underneath your deck. You get a lot of leaf cutters will actually make holes in dirt and lay their eggs in there. And then in the fall, we get the queen bumblebees that need a cozy place to stay. And for some of those solitary bees, again, also that cozy place to stay as adults, but also possibly as eggs or as pupa. So when you're cutting down those stems, keep in mind that there could be leaf eggs or pupa inside of that bee egg. Let's just talk a little bit about that solitary bee life cycle. So the nest sites can be very different. This is a bee inside of a hollyhock flower. It is not, in fact, emerging as a pupa. It was an adult that spent the night in the flower and is coming out during the day, but it kind of gives you a visual of what you might see in a lot of these different places. So they might, again, lay those eggs in the ground, in plant stems, or in wood. Sometimes you'll see little itty bitty holes in the wood. That could be beetles, so that can be bark beetle larvae that have gone into those little holes, or it could be some of our solitary bees. The eggs hatch and the larvae feed on the food that's left by the mother. Often if you're a leaf cutter bee, you've basically taken a leaf and you've rolled it into like a little crib almost. And inside of that, you've stuffed a nice little pollen pocket, a pollen pocket that is going to feed that baby as soon as it hatches. And you'll also see this with solitary wasps, except in a lot of cases, it's not a pollen little bundle, it's more of an insect bundle. Some will lay their eggs inside spiders, some will lay their eggs inside of caterpillars, and they will use that as their food source when they hatch. Then they're going to develop into the pupae and then the adults. But some of them can remain dormant in this stage for months or even years. So that's where this biodiversity idea comes in. Really, it's not an idea, but biodiversity is a really important thing, because you may have some species that will come out year after year, but others can stagger where the ideal conditions are, and they can emerge and become those key pollinators in years when other species may not be able to. So it's kind of ecological redundancy is what we would call it, where you have multiple species that can occupy the same niche, but it might be at different times depending on conditions. Meanwhile, the bumblebees, new colonies are going to begin in the spring from a single adult female who has left her nest now. She's gone out, she's already mated with the males by this point, and she is impregnated with eggs that she is going to start laying in the spring. She's going to search for a nest, which might be in an old birdhouse, it could be in an old rodent burrow, could be in dead wood again, might be under decks, could be in all sorts of different places. She is going to then lay her eggs. All of those eggs that hatch in the spring and a good amount of the summer will be females, and they will be her worker bees. And then she's going to start laying the males in midsummer. They have one job and only one job. As soon as they leave the nest, their job is to find those emerging queens and impregnate them. So basically, it's a life cycle. It's a female-dominated society, as a lot of them are in our insects, and they will have those males come out now. So same with the wasps. A lot of the wasps that you're seeing now are going to be those males. Fun fact, male bees and wasps cannot sting you. They do not have a stinger. So you're looking at those females as the ones, if you get stung, it is a female. And then at the end of the season, the next year's queens are going to do the same thing and start it all over again. So right now we have those bees. Some of them will be males, but a lot of them will be those queen bees for next year, looking for sustenance. And often the males, kind of to tell apart if you can't see the stinger, look for the big giant eyes. Male bumblebees tend to have bigger eyes than the females, and they also tend to be smaller. Smaller is not necessarily an indicator of a male, because we have over 40 species of bumblebees, and telling them apart can be kind of tricky sometimes. What else might you find in those plant stems? Well, if you ever visit the weasel head, some really fun stuff to look at are going to be galls. I love talking about galls because they're so fun, and we have some other naturalists who love talking about galls. Galls essentially are a swelling, and it's essentially the immune response of a plant in response to an invader. So that invader could be a bacteria, could be a fungus, or in a lot of cases, it's an insect. Some of the easiest ones that you've probably seen before are going to be goldenrod galls and willow galls, and both are caused by flies. There's the goldenrod gallfly and there's the willow gallfly, aptly named, and these are specialists, so they can only lay their eggs on these galls. And how they do it is that in the spring, mama is going to emerge as an adult from one of these galls. Then she is going to lay her egg, in the case of a goldenrod, somewhere in the stem, in the case of a willow, on the end of a willow branch. She is going to then, we're not actually sure if it's her or the egg, are going to trick the plant into building a home around her egg. And in the case of the goldenrod, in the wintertime, it'll look like little onions on these sticks. And in the case of willow, it looks like the willow has grown a pine cone. And inside of there, the egg will hatch. And all spring and all summer, that little larva is just going to eat its heart out inside of there as a little larva. Then in the fall, around now, it's going to go to the end. It's going to chew a tiny little hole, and then it's going to go back inside because as an adult, they don't have mouth parts. So the larva has to go and chew a little hole out of there, go back in, pupate, go into its cocoon for the winter. It will be in there all winter long, and then in the spring, it's going to emerge as an adult and start the life cycle all over. However, in the meantime, this is an excellent food source for our winter birds. And I'll talk about that in just a second as well. How about amphibians? Some of you might have seen there's a story that just came out of Edmonton where literally thousands of tiger salamanders were emerging from a wetland next to some homes. That's fairly unusual to have thousands of them. What's not unusual is to see tiger salamanders leaving wetlands at this time of year. Alberta is home to 10 amphibians, including tiger salamanders and this wood frog here, as well as 3 other frogs, 4 toads, and 1 other salamander. Generally speaking, they spend the winter as adults unless you are a tiger salamander because they have this magical capability in some cases to stay in a juvenile stage, which we call neoteny. So they maintain those juvenile characteristics, including gills, over winter. And some of them can spend literally years in this stage, and nobody has been able to figure out what triggers it or what triggers them to metamorphose completely into an adult, and some of them actually never do. So one of those great mysteries that maybe one day we'll solve. But at this time of year, tiger salamanders that have fully metamorphosed into an adult are looking for a place to spend the winter. And they are looking for logs and leaf litter. Those are the 2, or an old burrow. So pocket gopher burrows are a really hot spot for salamanders, as well as Richardson ground squirrel holes. People don't like gophers too much, but they're an excellent home for our beautiful tiger salamanders. And so they will look for upland habitat, and they can go over a kilometer away from their wetland in order to find it. So this is the time of year when usually people realize that we have tiger salamanders at all, because they have now left the wetland and they're looking for a place to overwinter. They may find their way into your window well. You might find them trying to go under your deck. Keep an eye out for them. Give them a safe space if they fall into your window well. If you can cover up that window well after safely removing with gloves or moist hands and giving them a safe space. Taking them back to the wetland is not the best idea because they're just going to start their journey all over again. And these guys are voracious predators. So they eat a ton of insects. They will eat any insect they can find. And as larvae, they will also eat each other. So as little tadpoles, they're eating each other. So they're quite voracious. So having insects that are underneath the leaf litter is going to help them on their journey and also can provide that space for them to overwinter. In the case of some frogs, boreal chorus frogs tend to stick close to their wetland. Wood frogs will stay relatively close, but they will venture a little bit more. And so if you are right by a woodland or wetland, you may find wood frogs that come to burrow underneath the leaf litter. And these guys will go as close to the surface as possible in order to hibernate because they want first access in the springtime. So they are capable of going in that layer that's not going to be thawed at all in the winter. That completely frozen layer of soil is where wood frogs will be, or leaf litter. They can literally freeze solid, like a frog popsicle. And in the spring, as soon as the sun starts warming that leaf litter or soil that they're in, they have this magical process where they're recycling their urine and there's all sorts of other chemicals involved, and they thaw out like a popsicle that they're literally dead, and then they come alive in the spring and they get first access to those wetlands because they are active before any other frog. Boreal chorus frogs will stay closer to the wetland in hopes that that gets them the advantage. Wood frogs will stay higher up to be frozen over the winter. And some of them will go like really a couple hundred meters. And again, some can travel several kilometers in order to find an ideal spot. Also birds. Some of my favorites are chickadees and nuthatches. In Alberta, we have 2 nuthatches, red-breasted and white-breasted nuthatches. Red are semi-migratory, white tend to be fairly resident. It's very confusing. The red ones sometimes move, sometimes don't. They might move a little tiny bit. They might move a long way. they're kind of all over the place with their migration. So white-breasted nuthatches tend to stay here for the winter. And we also have 3 chickadees that will also move sometimes a little bit. They'll shift between summer and winter habitat within the same place. So you're more likely to see mountain and boreal chickadees in the wintertime in the Weaselhead, but that doesn't mean that they're not nearby in the summer. So they're going to nest kind of a little bit further into the mountains, but they're going to come here for the wintertime. So you'll see the black-capped chickadee, our city bird, mountain chickadees and boreal chickadees, as well as the 2 nuthatches. You can find all of them in the Weaselhead. And in the summertime, they're going to be primarily eating insects, as well as spiders and caterpillars. And then they'll also be eating those seeds in the wintertime. Now the insects, if we look at those galls again, if you've ever put mealworms out for birds in the wintertime or spring or summer, whenever it might be, you're providing a little protein snack that they need. If they have access to that in the winter, it's that extra boost of energy to get them through those cold nights. If you have a gall nearby and you can peck a little hole into that gall, that's just like getting that little mealworm treat. Now, I have not found goldenrod galls in my yard, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to find them in your yard if you have goldenrod or willow. And leaving those stems there over the winter time is going to allow for those birds to come and get those little gall snacks. There could also be mites that are overwintering on leaves. So you'll see on poplar leaves, on aspen leaves, there's little raised things on there. So those are mites, and those are, again, a kind of gall. And once those leaves fall down, anything that's left in there is going to be really good food for these guys. They also are going to use landmarks to cache food. Chickadees, in some studies, have been shown to cache up to 100,000 seeds a year. Now, they're not going to remember all of those, where they put all of them, but they remember a good amount. That's one of their ecosystem services, is seed dispersal. So whatever they don't remember is hopefully going to grow into a new plant, or it provides food for somebody else in the system as well. So those 100,000 seeds, how do they remember it all? How do they remember where they put it? In a lot of cases, they're using landscape markers. So they've done studies where they've looked at how they navigate their caches. And if you take away a landmark like a plant or a chair even, or something that they've used to mentally map what they've cached there, if you take that away, they are not going to remember it anymore. So if you have chickadees in your yard right now, or blue jays, or whatever it may be, caching things for the winter time, leaving those landmarks that they've already got in their head, which you don't know what they are, they could be anything in your garden, using that there is going to help them find that food over the winter. Nuthatches also cache, except they do it differently. Usually they go underneath the bark, and they might do it in lichen or moss. So if you have an older home, an older garden, where you have those bigger trees, that might be where nuthatches are caching things. What about woodpeckers? Well, Alberta is home to 6 year-round residents, including northern flickers, pileated woodpeckers, three-toed, black-backed, hairy, and downy woodpeckers, all of which you can find in the Weaselhead, just throwing that out there for you. They all eat insects, fruit, and seeds, and that's going to be dependent on the season. So in the wintertime, if you have a suet feeder, you will find northern flickers and downies and hairies are regular visitors to them. If you're lucky enough to get a pileated, you have to live in an area where there's a lot of poplar trees, preferably older poplar trees, because that's where they like to spend a lot of their time. But they're going to primarily be eating insects. And so ants, caterpillars, and other bug larvae that are in the trees, underneath the bark, or in your leaf litter are also super important. They need those. Northern flickers during the summer, their primary food source is ants. In the wintertime, of course, those ants are all underground, but they can still find other little insects in the leaf litter. So you'll often find them on the ground kicking around in the leaf litter. And now's a good time actually also to find white-throated sparrows doing the same thing. They're kicking around in the leaf litter, stirring up bugs as they're migrating to their winter home. And then of course, there's our corvids. Some love them, some hate them. I love them all. Some of them are migratory, some of them are resident. So our magpies, of course, are here all year round. Ravens tend to be more present in the winter actually than in the summer. Crows are generally migratory, but we're finding some of them are staying closer over the winter. And blue jays also are apparently migratory. They're actually a new species to Alberta. They are native to Western or Eastern Canada, pardon me, Eastern Canada and Ontario, that area where they're very dependent on oak trees. Of course, we don't have oak trees out this way unless like a few and far between, but they actually have managed to be so comfortable around humans, and humans provide these fantastic sources in nuts often. And so they've been able to move westward. So some of them are going to move, migrate a little bit to warmer climates in the winter, and some of them will stay here. Individual choices. And then, of course, they're also going to be important for our rodent control. Not only do they come and eat all of our nuts, but they will also eat all of our mice if they're available, or they will clean up insects that are in your garbage. And in the case of magpies, people love to hate them because they say they kill songbirds. Yes, there's also a lot of things that kill and eat magpies, just for the record. They are also a good policing system. So they are one of the first things, if I have a predator in my yard, often the first warning is from a magpie who's come to chase it off, like this sharp-shinned hawk in the bottom there. So sharp-shinned hawks are one that will be here in the wintertime as well. Things like merlins sometimes are here. Goshawks will be here. We'll have a lot of these bird-eating predators that are still around, and magpies are going to be your early warning system. They'll be the first ones to tell you, and they will often, again, police them and chase them off. So they, yes, can hurt your songbirds, but also in some cases can save them as well. And while we're talking about birds, I would be remiss not to mention marking your windows. If you are going to be inviting birds into your yard, or even if you accidentally did it because you have a fantastic space and they're coming into it, please, 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 please mark your windows. Window strikes are the second leading cause of death for our birds, second only to cats. And there's actually some debate whether or not window strikes are number one. Estimates range from 16 to 42 million birds a year die from window strikes. That's just die from window strikes. I know there's somebody on the call today who is also a member of the Calgary Urban Species Response Team and has been going downtown and finding a lot of victims, both alive and deceased. So sometimes they live for a bit and we don't know the cause of death because we didn't find them. And in a lot of cases, they die on impact. And traditional decals that you'll find, those hawk stickers or whatever it may be, the UV stickers, those are not effective. It shows the birds that there's a barrier right at that spot where the decal is, but they will just fly around it and smack into the window. So the most effective thing that's been found is making a marker that is 2 inches apart. So whether that is getting feather-friendly window tape that you can see on the right-hand side here, or if that's taking a marker and going to town on your window, as you can see on the left-hand side here. You can do all kinds of things. I have let my daughter go out with her friends and color all over our windows before. We've now cleaned that off and we have feather-friendly window markers, and I have not had a strike since that's happened. I previously, unfortunately, did have some cedar waxwings that hit, and since then, none have hit. Also, bats. This is a time for bats that we don't necessarily think about as something that we want to attract to our gardens, but you might want to, because a lot of them are actually migrating right now. We have 9 bat species in Alberta, 3 of which we know leave the province. The other 6 shift between summer and winter roosts. Nobody yet knows where they go. So there's a lot of information gaps there. If you're finding bats in your yard, adding them into like a citizen science app like iNaturalist is super helpful for bat researchers. And we get big brown, little brown, long-legged, long-eared, western small-footed, and northern bats that we know hibernate in the province. Often we don't know where, but we know they're here. And winter roosting sites could be buildings. So they might be going into people's attics at this time of year, or they might be going into tree crevices. So again, if you have those older trees, or you have holes that have been created by our birds, like our woodpeckers, that's a place where bats might roost for the winter. And they eat so many bugs, you want them in your yard. In this time of year, when some of the flying insects like mosquitoes are few and far between, we might actually find more that we are getting them eating off of branches. So they're going to come down and they might eat your aphids, or they might eat spiders. They're going to eat all of those things that they can find on plants now. So having, again, they're not necessarily going to go down in the leaf litter, but they might be in your shrubbery, or they might be on plant stems. They need to be able to take off. So if you do find a bat on the ground, chances are it's just grounded itself and it needs a helping hand getting to a spot where it can take off. If you have a bat on the ground, the best thing to do is call one of our wildlife rehabs for further direction. They can tell you whether you should be taking it and putting it in a higher up spot, or if this is a bat that needs some extra help from a rehab. Never handle a bat without gloves on, whether you are rabies vaccinated or not. And also handling bats, if you don't have to, is never really a good idea. A lot of people will find them now in their umbrellas. They're just there for the day because, again, they have that nocturnal circadian rhythm where they're active at night and they're not during the day. So they're sleeping during the day. Lights can throw them off. Lights can also help them because it gets those moths and other insects that might fly around them. But overall, lights are not going to help our nocturnal life. Another one that we might think about in our gardens, love them or hate them, are our squirrels. And Alberta has 2 native tree squirrels. We've got several ground squirrels, but we have 2 native tree squirrels and 2 introduced. So we can see our sweet little red squirrel, which is native to Alberta, typically found in spruce forests or pine forests. It is quite dependent on spruce and pine cones. So if you live in an area where those pine cones or those pine trees or spruce trees are not, you are not going to see red squirrels. The introduced ones, like our gray, eastern gray squirrels up there in the corner, they are going to be ones that you will see in your yard. Also, western gray squirrels are also here. There's debate over whether or not they're introduced or not, but that's for another day. Eastern gray squirrels are those typical black or gray ones that you will see kind of everywhere, and they're going to be the major seed dispersers this time of year. If you live in a newer neighborhood, you probably are going to see these guys after, we've just started seeing them around here after 15 years. So it takes a little while for these critters to come because they also need those trees. They may find their way into your attic. They may find their way into birdhouses. They may dig up some of your garden, but they're also a really important part of our ecosystems. They're important for seed dispersal. They're important for prey items for a lot of species. If you're lucky enough to have a bobcat around, bobcats eat squirrels. So that's going to be one of the things that you're going to see more of. If you don't want a bobcat in your yard, probably don't feed the squirrels. We also get our northern flying squirrels. And if you want to see them in Calgary, again, you want to go where there's older trees. Weaselhead has them. I have not seen them, but one of our naturalists has, and I say this every time I talk about flying squirrels. I'm really jealous, and one day I'm going to see them. One day. They're also in Fish Creek Park. You can find them in Griffith Woods. One common characteristic there, a lot of older trees, a lot of older poplars. Older poplars where we've had some species like our pileated woodpeckers or our northern flickers, which have made holes in the tree, which now become home for these northern flying squirrels. So they need somebody else to excavate a hole for them, and then they will take up occupancy. So our woodpeckers, again, really important, and leaving those standing dead trees is also really important. They eat a lot of fungi and lichen and moss. So if you have a lot of decaying wood in your yard, you might be able to see a northern flying squirrel if you live adjacent to some of these areas with those trees that are ideal for a flying squirrel. We also get these critters are really important for that seed dispersal. So they're also, particularly the eastern squirrels, are caching a lot of seeds. You know that's why they're digging up your garden. They might be going after your bulbs, but they're also planting seeds and nuts under there. And like those chickadees, they're going to remember where a lot of them are, but not all of them. And in the springtime, those may turn into new plants. And if you do leave some of these older things like those dead trees, again, you're providing habitat that might prevent them from coming into your attic as well. I'm going to end with my favorite one, skunks. Skunks are one of those controversial things that sometimes people love them and sometimes people hate them. Why should you love a skunk? Well, because they're going to eat a lot of the things that you don't want in your yard, like slugs, mice, and wasps. So if you have those yellow jackets that are nesting in the ground underneath your deck, you may find that skunks might come in there and clear it out for you. You might not have to do anything at all. Of course, the downside to skunks is that they do spray. And so caution does need to be taken to make sure that you are checking before you let dogs out. Mistake I made this summer. We let our dog outside. She went right to the corner where our skunk friend was, got sprayed right in the mouth. When she gets wet 2 months later, she still smells like a skunk. That's on me. I should have known better. Because we do have a skunk that comes in regularly, and I do not have slugs. I also do not have any damage from my skunk, so I don't have them eating all of the things that I want. They haven't eaten all of my berries. I know that they're going to come in and eat things that I don't want, like those slugs and those mice. We also haven't seen a ton of wasps in our yard, but I suspect that's a bigger thing, more beyond the skunks. They tend to go in the wintertime when it gets really, really cold. They will go into torpor, but as we have Chinooks here, they might wake up in the middle of winter. So it's not unusual that a skunk might be out and about in January, February, March if we've had a mild winter. And they're going to be looking for food. And where are they going to go? They're going to go, well, into garbages and things, or they're going to go into that leaf litter or into that wood and start pawing around looking for little critters that are in there. They might be under your step for the winter. They might be under your deck or a shed. If you do not want them there, digging chicken wire down about 6 inches is going to be the best thing to do, and putting that all around. If you already have skunks in there and you would like to get rid of them, using a rag soaked in ammonia is going to be your best bet. But be cautious not to use bleach on that rag beforehand, otherwise you will create a toxic chemical, and that's going to hurt everybody involved. Moving them in the spring when a female is already denning and has young in there is going to take a lot of lives, so I would advocate not. But this is the time of year when they are looking for places to den for the winter. So this is the time you want to block off those spaces where you do not want them. Again, they're mostly active at night, just like those owls and those bats. So you're probably not going to see them a lot. They also don't have the best sight, or they're not great at hearing either. So this is why they have this magnificent defense of being able to spray everything so that nothing wants to come near it, because they don't have the keenest senses. Their sense of smell is really good. Their sense of hearing and sight, less so. But if you do make that noise and turn on those lights, that's enough of a distraction that they should notice that there is something there and hopefully just leave, because they don't want to spray you. This is the last resort for them. And how do you know? Since they're nocturnal, well, you put out a camera, of course. Here's this is a few years ago, as you can see, 2021. This is my friendly skunks in my yard. They were coming. I had a puzzle outside for my dog, which my dog only sort of paid attention to, ate some of the things, and the skunks came in and cleaned up the rest of it. So remote cameras are a fantastic thing to see what's going on in your yard at night. Doorbell cameras also work, of course, but having those cameras set up is a non-invasive way to see who is using your space at night. And that is where I will leave it. We've kind of covered a lot of different things. I'm always open to answering questions, and I'm happy to answer questions now because I know we do have time. You're welcome to email me or check out my website, growwildyyc.com. I'm going to stop screen sharing and come back to Rebecca in case anybody has any questions.